Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society.
Dmitri Shufutinsky, welcome once again to the Dissidents Podcast. We're so glad to have you. You are a frequent guest, frequent guest, and a friend of ours, author of Jiu-Jitsu, and that is Jew Jitsu. So, which we have talked about. We'll put links to that as well. But the reason that we're talking today is you have just written a piece in the White Rose magazine. It is titled "The Woke Right Keeps the Pendulum Swinging." And I got really excited when I read that, because one of the things that we've been looking at ILV lately is, what are liberal values, right? And liberal values aren't left or right. And so for the past, 5 years, we've been really looking at where illiberalism on the left. And we've seen a lot of what we would consider illiberalism now on the right. So when White Rose magazine came out with this edition, looking at some of the extremism, and with yours in particular, I really jumped at the opportunity to get your point of view on this. So before I go any further, just if you want to, I will, for our audience, the link will be in the show notes, but just give us an overview of the article itself, what prompted you to write it, kind of where you are right now in this space.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me back on the podcast. But I actually was pitched to write something. I was informed by the White Rose magazine that they wanted to do an issue on this woke right, what many people have called it. And I thought it was perfect timing because I'd noticed, especially within the last few months, this increase, maybe from bad actors on the algorithm of social media, but of people like Candace Owens, the Hodge twins, Dave Smith, certainly, and other podcasters or comedians or people who say that they're just asking questions, as I point out in my article, but really have kind of a twisted worldview that paints, like the woke left, paints a certain class of people as a victim, and yet it's a different class. And they also seek to be very isolationist and also apologetic towards regimes that are not only illiberal, but mean our country harm, and in fact mean all of Western civilization harm.
So when you're talking about like this kind of new victimization, and I think it's a new identity politics, what does that look like? I mean, you mentioned the just asking questions is kind of a cue, if you will, or a key word to kind of some of the language that the woke right is using. But with this victimization, with this identity politics, what does that look like? We saw with the left that it was like, pronouns and very, casting yourself in group identities versus as an individual. How is that different when the woke right employs it?
Right. Well, I'm going to get into that, but I want to go back just a little bit on a related topic that a few years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I read a book by Vivek Ramaswamy called Nation of Victims.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentioned that he back then saw a trend, I think it was late 2022 or early 2023, of some on the far right who were beginning to adopt this kind of victim mentality that he had seen basically conquer a large swathe of the left. And he warned against it, which I found a little bit interesting because Ramaswamy is somebody who, when he was campaigning at least, seemed a little bit apologetic for Putin and also seemed quite isolationist himself. But I've definitely noticed that actually did come true. And so what we see here with the woke right and their victimization is they're taking legitimate grievances of some people, but they're putting it on steroids and trying to encourage holding on to those grievances. So with the left, what we saw were things about systemic racism or capitalist, cis heteronormative patriarchy, kind of oppression, things that were rooted in, their societal issues from previous decades and that, to some degree still exist today. But we've largely, as a country and society, moved on beyond that. There's not Jim Crow anymore. Women have the right to vote and hold, you know, pretty much any job, and so on. Here on the woke right, what we've seen is that the idea of uh, straight white men, Christians, who have kind of been ignored or sidelined, people from the working class or blue collar, especially poor people from those classes who have been sidelined or even belittled by some on the woke left, are being told in a way, your grievances aren't just valid, but you need to hold on to them, and that should take precedence over everything. We only need to care about you. So we see in particular right now the wars in Ukraine and Israel. I'm not dying for Ukraine, I'm not dying for Israel, and all this stuff. And it's funny because neither of those countries have asked anybody from the United States to fight and die for them. And there's this strange idea that in order to be an American or an American first, you can only care about this country and not see the potential dangers of other regimes that may be fighting allies or other countries abroad when we withdraw from the world. And it's just it's something that is being tied by many actors like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens into this kind of woke far right isolationist mentality that in some ways also connects with elements on the woke left. So not only does it keep the pendulum swinging because there could be a woke left backlash to that, but also because it in some way legitimizes the woke ideology itself and creates these kind of connections between the two poles of the horseshoe or of the magnet.
Right. The horseshoe theory, as they say, I mean, they're the the extremes of the left and the right are actually kind of closer to touching each other. And you mentioned that, and you just kind of touched on it now. But if you could go back into, you had mentioned that they're kind of the same with regards to Ukraine.
Yes.
Extremism. Can you give our audience a little bit of background on both kind of what the position of the left is and what the right is? And by the way, for our audience, I'm not going to keep saying woke and extreme. Like when I'm saying in this conversation, when I say left and right, I'm claiming the extremes. So can you say the positions of the extremes for both the left and the right and where they are alike and where they, with you regards to Ukraine, and where they differ?
Yeah, well, the mainstream of both the Democrat and Republican parties, I would say, are definitely pro-Ukraine. There may be some in the Republican Party for various reasons who are a little bit less vocal about it now than they once were. But when you go into the extreme wings, you have people like, for example, Candace Owens or even Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have uplifted this false kind of idolized image of Vladimir Putin as a protector of Christianity, because Putin is, oppressive towards the LGBT community, because he has made the Russian Orthodox Church sort of a proxy of his, particularly with its ideological campaign against what they call wokeness, and it goes beyond what we call wokeness into classical liberal values as well, but also because of this idea that Putin is somehow challenging corruption, challenging warmongers in the West. That's kind of the view of the extreme right, that Putin feels like he is challenging an existing globalist order that has, in their view, unfairly targeted Russia while also having gutted the working class in this country and throughout the West. On the left, you do have some groups like Code Pink or even the founders of Ben and Jerry's who are anti-Ukraine for other reasons. For them, ideologically, there's still this commitment or nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And in its own way, that also is a false image of what Russia is. Putin is not a communist. And I often tell people when they say he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union, he's actually trying to recreate the Russian Empire, which is very different. I mean, Putin does wed himself to the church, and a communist never would have done that. But with them, they see NATO as imperialist. They blame NATO expansion for Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And a lot of people on the far left have been calling for a ceasefire at all costs and have even called Ukraine a tool of Western imperialism rather than a sovereign country fighting against imperialism. But a lot of this is really based on just falsehoods outright, whether people on the far left are ignoring that Putin is not a communist but is an imperialist, or people on the far right who see him as somehow defending the Christian religion, when in fact abortion rates are very high in Russia. The birth rate is very low, and church attendance has basically flatlined for many, many decades now. Um, their demographics even before the war were in a catastrophic position. So a lot of this is based on false lies in trying to portray Russia as the victim, just like this kind of extreme ideology that we call woke does for whichever group is using it. They need a victim class, and here they want to make Russia a victim so they can identify with it.
It's so interesting. Taking a bit of a sidebar here, but with regards to Russian demographics, geopolitically, one could argue the reason that they are as aggressive now as they are is because their demographics are so in decline that if they don't make these moves now to conquer countries, they will not be able to in the next 5-10 years as their military increasingly ages. So there's that, as well as and a lot of what I've heard, coming from a geopolitical background, is I think that this idea of a the USSR, a lot of the states like Ukraine and Poland were the buffer, if you will, to the heartland, Moscow, St. Petersburg, for Russia. And so whether or not they're trying to recreate the USSR, I would say you're right. They're trying, it's a Russian imperialism, but it is this sense that they need to, kind of regain that buffer zone of these states while they can,
Yeah.
because of their demographics. And it's all frightening. But the
Yeah.
idea that he is, and you wrote this is, I really didn't get this until I read your article. And this is another trend that's super disturbing to me, is this Christ is king. And this is coming from someone who identifies as a Christian, but that they're using Christianity as their kind of their main point of supporting Putin. And that to me is very unchristlike. You want to talk a little bit more about this kind of Christ is King movement and how it's affecting the right extremes?
Yeah. Well, the good news, I think, is that a lot of people see through this facade of people who make those tweets or statements about Christ is King. A lot of times, that's just being used to try and um, how do you say, gaslight or dog whistle at, whether it's Jews or people in the LGBT community, or other people that they think are somehow coming after Christianity. But a lot of these people themselves are not particularly, as you said, embracing or reflecting Christian values. I mean, on one hand, they're defending Putin, who has bombed I don't know how many churches in Ukraine and has killed many thousands of Christians. And then also on the other hand, you have Candace Owens, who a lot of people don't realize in Africa, in Nigeria in particular, there's been so many jihadist massacres and attacks similar to what Israel experienced on October 7th, but for many, many years. And she's had nothing to say of it. So she's talking about being a strong Christian and very, in defense of Christianity. And yet she has said nothing about Christians who are being targeted for their faith. And especially as somebody who, I'm Black and she's Black, and she's not speaking out about other Black people who are victims of horrific terror and massacres. It's very disgraceful and it's gaslighting. But I do think there are some people who use Christ as King. I've seen them use it for, Easter tweets or other, things that you would expect to see that phrase on. And I feel almost like these woke right people have taken that and used it and twisted it into different purposes. I do think most people see through it, though, and realize most of their posts where they're using that really have nothing to do with Jesus or with Christianity. And I don't think it's really taken as deep of a hold as some of them may have expected or wanted it to.
So discussing Candace Owens, I've got two kind of questions about her. one that's more general, one that's specific. So I'll go more general first. We've seen Candace Owens, moving from Christianity, make some pretty anti-Semitic statements. And there is this concern about if the extreme right gets any ground. I mean, the extreme right is known as the anti-Jewish, more anti-Semitic, Nazis, skinhead type organization, right? The extreme of it. And so when you see people now, I would call Candace Owens an extremist, anyways. But when you see that kind of trickle in to some of the language, the anti-Semitism in some of the language, can you tell us where you've seen an uptick in anti-Semitic language from the right, and can you compare that again to what you've seen? Because a lot of people don't notice it when it's coming from the left. But we've also seen an uptick in anti-Semitic language on both sides of the polls. So can you kind of walk us through what you're seeing there?
Yeah, well, on the far right, it's interesting because, like you said, you've always had the white supremacists and neo-Nazis who have hated the Jewish people, and we've known that a lot of the Jewish organizations in the United States, at least, have focused on that. But the rhetoric on the far right has changed about the Jews. There is still the traditional rhetoric about, the Jews as Christ killers and, going to hell for not believing in Jesus, or even kind of that Nazi, like, racial kind of speak. But what has changed also about the way that the woke right speaks about Jews is that, like the woke left, they've covered it in anti-Zionism. So they talk about Israel manipulating the US government or other countries, or Israel as a warmonger, and then use, for example, phrases like Christ is king underneath, which is like, you know, that has undertones of just the traditional kind of very far right, Jews as Christ killers, to use that underneath a statement about a country, but you're only really doing it because it's the Jewish state. But you also have other instances of, Israel's going to drag us into war. Israel has closed borders, but why shouldn't we? Israel wants us to have unfettered immigration, things that aren't even really true. And yet it's being used, the word Israel, to replace Jew. These people 25 years ago would have said, Jews want us to have open borders. Jews are dragging us into war. Now they're using Israel. And one good example of how you see the two sides of the horseshoe come together is when you have people in the Young Turks who are very far left suddenly agreeing with or echoing Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, even Mehdi Hassan a few days ago had retweeted or shared something agreeing with Tucker Carlson, trying to say that Israel wants to drag the United States into endless wars and things like this. And Mehdi Hassan, is very far left. He also has espoused Islamist ideology. So for somebody like that to suddenly agree with Tucker Carlson, who's very far right on the total opposite, is kind of like an updated version of David Duke and Louis Farrakhan.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a really good analogy. Well, because speaking of these people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, and this was my more specific question, and we can bring Tucker Carlson into the question: do these people really matter? I mean, personally, but I'm not really on social media, period. So it doesn't affect me. But does Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson? I mean, I kind of already had thought of them as extremists in a sense. You had mentioned in your article other people like Joe Rogan, right, who I hadn't thought of as an extremist. So are these people, these voices that are more the extreme, that are getting all the social media time, and you'd mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, kind of the algorithms, if you will, do you think that they are really representative of a growing movement, or are they just, the loud fringe?
I think that they're the loud fringe. I mean, they have their old faithful who will agree with them about everything and stand by them. Um, and they may convert, so to speak, some people into their ideology. But if you just look at how much their content has been promoted over the past few months on various platforms, it seems very artificial. It may have wide views, but even if you go into the comments, you see a lot of people saying, I used to like or agree with this person, but I think they've kind of lost their way. Or some who say, I agree with them on maybe 60% of things or 80% of things, but they're wrong here. So I don't think this is like a crisis mode necessarily. The danger is just how much it's promoted. Can it impact young people? Some young people who are more conservative, some studies are suggesting that the next generation, Gen Z, is shifting a little bit to the right. But then you also have questions about what exactly is the goal here of these people? Is it to convert more people? Is it seriously to ask questions? I do think that there are some among them, like Piers Morgan or Joe Rogan, who in a way are grifters. They just want people to click and watch. Maybe they're getting paid by somebody else to bring on these people. And they'll take advantage of anything that's popular in order to have uh, their views and their money. Are they true believers? I mean, I can't really say, but the the way that a lot of these people, even Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens for that matter, have shifted so far in their viewpoints, even from 3 years ago, leads me to suspect that a lot of this is artificial and that there's something else going on there behind the scenes, especially when you look at how much the algorithm has pumped this through.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that brings me to one other person that I wanted to bring up. I think it's Jason Hinkle. Is it? Did I say
Yes, Jackson
okay.
Hinkle.
Jackson. I have never heard this person before, so maybe that's a good thing for our audience in the sense that one of these extremists, like he's not even on my radar. That's also not saying much when I'm not much on social media, but he calls himself a MAGA communist.
Yes.
What the hell is that? I don't even know what that is. Explain
You
to me.
know what? Honestly, I'm not quite sure I do either. It sounds very much like meaningless gobbledygook.
Yeah.
But he is somebody who has never once supported our country or our allies against any foe. I mean, so since Israel and Iran have started fighting directly, he has posted numerous images of himself, like kind of altered images of himself with, stand with Iran or pictures of the Ayatollah, things like this. Certainly he's done it, visiting Beirut for Hezbollah parades or visiting Yemen for parades with the Houthis, encouraging American troops to, when the U.S. was attacking the Houthis, to disobey orders to do so, to stand with the Houthis. He's supported Russia, of course, against Ukraine. He's a very ardent supporter of Vladimir Putin. Actually, either yesterday or today, he even put out a tweet saying, China, now is the time to take Taiwan, suggesting that if America is distracted with these two other huge wars, go ahead and take it. So he's very pro-China. He also has voiced support for North Korea. He has never voiced any support whatsoever for the United States or any of our other allies. And at times he's even suggested that Donald Trump, even though Hinkle identifies as somebody who's part of MAGA in some form or the other, he's suggested at times that Donald Trump has betrayed MAGA by supporting Israel. So very, very interesting. We've seen similar comments by other people like Nick Fuentes, for example.
Well, that kind of goes back to what you mentioned also, America first versus America only. And so I want to touch on some geopolitics again, because that's, kind of where I lean into these conversations. But we've seen an isolationist trend happen for a while now. A lot of that is geopolitical. It's really non-political insofar as, America as a country, it has, two very defensible, oceans. Its borders are very, rather defensible. Obviously, we've got human trafficking, drug trafficking, and whatnot. But we're not at war with our our neighbors, and now with fracking and all the kind of the resources that we've had, we've been able to really get what we want in terms of trade in our own neighborhood. And so we've relied less and less, for example, on the Middle East for a lot of natural resources. We still have, we rely, well, that's a strong word, but a lot of us rely on cheap goods from China. But we've seen even that, this kind of isolationist trend coming. Again, is at the expense of some of our allies. I think we could still be a world leader and be a little more isolationist, but it seems like it's always an either or, right? It's either America first, well, America first meaning America only, or we're completely globalist. There's no in between there. Are you reading that kind of similarly, or do you see any trends where it's both and? I mean, what are your concerns around this? Because I think you nailed it with America first doesn't have to be America only. And I think that people have really logged on, like just glammed onto this America first, meaning America only. And we've seen it in the way I think some of the extreme right is talking and a lot of the rhetoric.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and I also think that many on the extreme right are taking it to a whole different level of, somebody who's isolationist traditionally may not want to get involved in other wars, but probably would not be rooting for America's adversaries. Even America only people, I would guess, would not be rooting for American adversaries. People who are rooting for people like Vladimir Putin, who put a bounty on American troops in Afghanistan. You can't call yourself an America first or even an America only person if you're supporting somebody like that. The Ayatollah, who we know has had some involvement trying to kill President Trump or other American government officials, or even trying to target American citizens and communities like the Jewish community. This is not somebody that an American only or America first person would support. The same goes for China. Much of our fentanyl issues and also our the gutting of the working class has come from China. These are not countries or regimes that mean America well. So nobody who defines themselves as an isolationist or prefers to focus on problems at home really would be rooting for any of these. It's different if you say, I don't want us to be involved in the war in the Middle East or in Ukraine, but I support them, or I support maybe giving some kind of humanitarian aid. That's a different thing. We can have discussions about whether that's enough or not, but those people are still not rooting for countries and governments that mean to do Americans harm. So I think that is where we are with the woke right. It has gone in a completely different direction, even from traditional isolationism.
So let's go to current events. You wrote this article in May, middle of May, or it was released in the middle of May. We've seen Israel go in and a very successful attack on Iran. What is with these paradigms of extreme right, extreme left? What are you seeing from that? What are your concerns with the latest international event on both sides of the issue? What is the language coming out of it? Who are the actors? What do we need to watch for? What are your concerns?
Well, actually, I'm starting to feel a little bit more comfort in some sense, if that makes, if you can even say that, in the direction that we're going with them. First of all, just a few days ago, The Atlantic published an article with Donald Trump kind of disavowing very subtly Tucker Carlson, who had tweeted. First of all, he hasn't really been tweeting much during this conflict, but he did release a tweet suggesting that America should kind of stay out of the Middle East and try and distance itself from Israel. And Donald Trump, in the Atlantic article, had said something along the lines of allowing Iran to go nuclear isn't peace and it's not Americans first.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that and Donald Trump is one of those people who will be adored by his base no matter what he says, whether people like it or not. So I think that does have the potential to disconnect some of these woke right people from MAGA or really from any position of influence. And as far as on the other side, on the left, there are some people out there who are still making similar statements, blaming Israel for the conflict. We need a ceasefire and just to have endless nuclear talks with Iran that really go nowhere. And in fact, we know where they would lead. But again, I think because of the success so far of Israel's operation, as difficult as it is with the missiles that are landing in Israel, once it is over, I think that a lot of these people and what they had been promoting their propaganda that it would lead into nuclear war and things like this to be discredited. They're not really going to have as much influence or sway or credibility. And that's why I think we're seeing some of these tweets. They seem almost like a last gasp, like desperation. Um, so, I mean, we'll have to wait and see, of course, like how these wars end up, and if if the president keeps his position, as he said in the Atlantic. Um, but that is kind of what I'm seeing here, and I expect that some people behind the scenes who are paying and influencing these people on both the woke left and the woke right are going to decide, that we didn't get a return on investment. It's time to direct our energy elsewhere and kind of stay out of the shadows.
Speaking of, and you mentioned this in your article, people who kind of stir the pot on both sides are countries like Qatar.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about that, because I think that is fascinating. You've done research on this. I know your mother, Brandy Shufutinsky, has done research on this, and to see that influence, because if you're not looking, it's not obvious. They're not coming out and saying, this elementary school is supported by the Qatari, government. Tell us a little bit more how Qatar has played a role in both. What's the word? Manipulating. That's the word I want to use. Manipulating both sides of the political spectrum, and why? For what reason?
Well, the reason that they're doing that is that way they win no matter what.
Mm.
So I think what we've seen with many on the radical left in their alliance with radical Islam is Qatar already has its return on investment there. But there was a clear concern for them. I mean, going back to the first Trump administration, that the right was not happy with this. Trump back then had called out Qatar for supporting different terrorist organizations and seemed to be relatively supportive at the time of the blockade by many of our more moderate Arab allies of Qatar for the several months that they did that. Um, so I think after Donald Trump was replaced with Joe Biden in 2021, Qatar realized they had to do something to make inroads with the Republican Party. And of course, they knew about the fringe who already hated Jews, hated Israel, was against Western civilization as we know it. And they decided we can kind of make our influence and inroads there. But there are other actors also who have done something very similar, and maybe that's where Qatar kind of got their inspiration from. My mom always calls Russia, at least under Putin, a Tasmanian devil. It will cause chaos in any way it can, not necessarily to achieve a goal, but to disrupt. So what Russia's done with its bot farms, both on the far left and the far right, China has done very similar things. So I think the main thing for Qatar here is they have more, certainly more than Russia right now. They have more money and means to do this. And China also right now is having some economic difficulties. I think Qatar is more than willing to step into the fold with its resources. And so you had many people concerned about Donald Trump's trip to Doha. There are also other people, Theo Vaughn, who went to Qatar, and all of a sudden he came back and on podcast accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. There were other people. Piers Morgan was recently in Doha, and then he came back and on his show has done almost a complete 180 on his position on Israel, although I don't think that he has positions on anything at all, personally. But there have been other people very much like this who have gone to Qatar, who have praised Qatar in some form or other. Steve Witkoff, even many people had serious concerns about him and his ties to it. And then Tucker Carlson was another one. And I think that is somebody that, many people have started to see the pattern and have kind of labeled him as a Qatari agent. But the one thing that Qatar does not like, that we know from a few years ago at the World Cup, and also the scandal with the EU Parliament with bribery and corruption charges, on behalf of lobbying for Qatar by certain lawmakers there, they don't like being in the spotlight when their influence or their human rights abuses have come out. So something else I think that will kind of help diminish these very extremist campaigns is that they are in the spotlight now. They're in the spotlight for their ties to different influential people and their bankrolling of whether university departments or certain media platforms. They're in the spotlight for that and also for supporting terrorism. And the groups that they funded are being crushed. So at some point, I think they're going to have to realize we need to roll back our monetary campaign in these areas and try to kind of keep quiet, as they did after the World Cup and the EU scandal.
So what is there, like, for a lot of us who don't, follow some of these various international issues, what is Qatar's endgame in the United States? What are they at with the influence? What are they after? Just supplication, or that the United States never really looks at them and involves them in any type of international conflict? Why are they going to such ends?
They want to, well, geopolitically, they want to make a rift between the U.S. and Israel because Qatar, like Turkey, supports the Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm.
So they support a lot of this radical jihadist ideology and groups in the Arab Spring that are still fighting it out in Libya, in Syria. There's some groups, different organizations, and Israel is relatively successful at fending off many of these groups. Of course, now it's focused on Iran and its proxies. But their idea is that if we create a distance between Israel and the United States, it would be much easier for Qatar and Turkey, through the Muslim Brotherhood, to dominate the Middle East.
I see.
But it goes even beyond that. I mean, Qatar also has certain relationships with other American adversaries, Putin, the Taliban,
Mhm.
and also China. So I write scripts for China Uncensored, the YouTube news channel, and my latest episode script that came out was about China and Qatar's relationship, which has deepened over the past several years. Well, something else that a lot of people don't realize is that Taiwan relies heavily on liquefied natural gas from Qatar. But now Qatar has also made similar deals with China. So, in the event that there was a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it's not, out of the imagination that China could call Doha and say, "We'd like you to shut off Taiwan's access and shipments of gas," which would make it much easier for China to either force Taipei to capitulate or otherwise just have its way with Taiwan, assuming that other countries weren't getting involved. So Qatar has this strategy, I think, of undermining a lot of countries that it claims to be helping with negotiations or with financial contributions, almost like a leech. It wants to use resources and make itself look good with many of our countries, but really means to do us harm on the global stage and also within.
So on that note, on talking about the Middle East and the visits to Doha, tell us more about your reaction to Trump's visit to the Middle East before everything that's now happening in Iran. What do you make of that? What do you take from that? How do you think that's going to fuel any political rivalries here from the right or the left?
Well, I do think that Trump wanted something of an easy win with getting economic deals with many of these countries, pledging no more kind of regime change wars. The scars, I think, run very deep from what happened with Iraq in the region. And so I do think that a lot of that had to do with Trump saying, look, we're not here anymore to do these nation building adventures. And to some degree, I support and understand that. But it's very hard to read also because Trump didn't stop by Israel, so there were a lot of concerns. What does that mean? This ceasefire with the Houthis that came about, where Israel was kind of left out of the equation. And there were a lot of questions and some concerns, especially as it related to Qatar. A lot of the countries in the region seemed to be distancing themselves potentially from peace with Israel, but at the same time, a lot of those countries also say one thing in public and behind closed doors say another. So I imagine that there was some conversation behind closed doors about a timeline for making peace with Israel. On the other hand, also, the United States now has much more leverage with these countries with weapons sales or economic deals that help them. Um, so Trump, a lot of people look at it as, oh, Trump will put only pressure on Israel, but at the same time, he can put pressure on those countries and say, I want the Nobel Peace Prize. You need to normalize at this time. We're cutting off, whatever aid or deals. So, I mean, a lot remains to be seen. I think we don't really know a lot. But some of my concerns that I did have about Qatar or Iran have been, over the past few days, for obvious reasons, kind of allayed.
Yeah. And like what you were saying earlier, I think it's interesting your take that perhaps this, you know, most recent development might actually, the silver lining domestically might be that it kind of tamps down some of the extreme voices and or uh, really makes obvious some of the extreme voices and as what they are, as extremists versus, someone who really truly has America's interests at heart.
Yeah, there is some level of worry I do have, though. I mean, some of these people are being backed a little bit into a corner. And when a cornered animal will fight. So there's still, as we've sadly seen in Minnesota, the danger of violence happening or some kind of rioting or anything like that. Um, so we should still be vigilant,
Yeah.
but being vigilant doesn't mean being hopeless or always being discouraged or not fighting back when you can. So that's kind of what I'm taking away from this. And also we have to be mindful that even in that situation, should things kind of be finished off with a victory with the Middle East, there are other bad actors out there who can still kind of fill that void. China is certainly one of them, and then the war in Ukraine is another kind of hot ember, keeping some of these people on both extremes alive and relevant to a degree. So there's still some work to be done and some things kind of to be aware of in order to challenge these extremist voices.
Yeah, and I would say, what I've noticed is just a growing anti-Semitism, and again, from both extremes, and that we've seen with regards to violence, violence in particular targeting Jewish individuals or what they are believed to be Jewish individuals at various events. So that's something that's really concerning too. I mean, where the rhetoric might still be French to the extent that it is influencing people to such action, that's where it's concerning.
Yeah, and I also do have questions about how much of the hostility towards Ukraine from the extremes have to do with Zelensky being Jewish.
Mm.
And there are other people in the military or government there who are high profile who are Jewish, or like there's one rabbi who's been kind of prominent in some media and social media in the Ukrainian army. So I do wonder about how much of that even has to do with some of the hostility towards Ukraine. Um, but yeah, it is something we have to keep in mind. And also, as an American, I mean, looking at what's happening in other countries like Canada or the United Kingdom or New Zealand, I don't want my country to end up like that. So I think really we have examples of who are or were some of our closest allies, and what do we not do to not end up that way. So as somebody, I would encourage people who are America first or want to make America great again to look over there and realize that we don't want to feed the extremism. We want to stop the pendulum. And as I wrote in my article, most people, in my opinion, in November, with the choice that they made, did so because they were tired of very wacky ideas that represent a fringe group being promoted as kind of the mainstream. And whether you liked one candidate over the other, or liked the options that were available, it was clear that, in my opinion, most people felt that one side sounded a little bit more like it could provide for normalcy and settling down, as opposed to constant chaos and absurdity. And I think that, it's been we're a quarter of a century into the 21st century. There's already been so many world changing events. I think a lot of people would like the opportunity to just settle down, have a good life, have some semblance of normalcy and getting along in kindness. And going into these extreme directions or feeding them is not going to allow us to do that. So we have to really reject both of them.
Yeah. And you gave a couple of ideas on what might work. So one of your, big points is to have a new mainstream media. What does
Mm-hmm.
that look like to you?
Well, a lot of our media outlets that are mainstream are overwhelmingly staffed by people of only one political party or the other. Instead of just reporting the news and kind of leaving it at that, where you shouldn't be able to tell the leaning of that anchor. Um, you know, we have almost like a game show or a talk show. Almost every news channel's main shows at different hours is more like watching The View than watching something about the news. Um, on top of that, even looking at printed media, we have too many people who, and sometimes are invited on as guests of shows, who've been consistently wrong about many things, but are still labeled as experts and are still asked to print a lot of things that in some ways are damaging or harmful to national cohesion or certain communities or alliances. And I think it's time to realize we're living in a different era. We need to have either a plethora of different voices and viewpoints to where we can have a respectful discussion and debate, or really we should have news that, kind of like in the old days, well before my time, reports the news and leaves it to the viewer to decide what to think about that.
Hmm. That doesn't feed the algorithm.
Right. But I think it's up to us, to the people, to do, to have more shows like this, a podcast where you could discuss topics instead of twisting history like some have done to make it seem like Winston Churchill was the villain of the Second World War. To actually discuss what's going on, what are different viewpoints on a certain topic, and leave it at that without this kind of these beefs that have emerged among podcasters and name calling and nastiness, or the kind of things that we see on a lot of the panels on many of our news channels today.
Yeah.
I don't think that really educates anybody, or promotes calm or living together as Americans in peace, as so many of these networks like to claim that they're in favor of.
So as we end, again, your piece, it is the woke right keeps the pendulum swinging. Tell us what your biggest concern of the woke right keeping the pendulum swinging, and what your biggest hope is.
Well, my biggest concern would be that there will be a constant, as we move forward into the century, a constant sway between both extremes, even when most people do not support them. Um, and we've seen it with a lot of things, where you have very extreme ideas, policy ideas promoted and talked about almost as if it's mainstream, even when it's not. So my concern is that we're going to have more people in elected positions or other, positions of authority that represent a very small group of people, but are very extremist, and that the majority of Americans aren't going to be heard. We're not a country that, as one of my professors said, likes isms very much. We don't like, Marxism or communism. That's not what kind of country we are. We're a country that's very centrist, moderate, has debates, has differences, but for the most part, find a middle ground and find a way to get things done. And I think most Americans still do want that. So my concern is that that era could slip away. But my hope is also that, like I said, most Americans are moderate. and see through a lot of the facade, and that especially many of these figures are being discredited, and that they'll hold less clout going forward. I think that we'll see whether or not that's the case in a few weeks or months.
Yeah. Thank you so much for an excellent piece. Again, for our audience, that will be on our show notes. We will also have Dmitri next month for a live panel discussion. I think we just named it July 10th, the date. We just named the date July 10th at 7 p.m. So stay tuned for that with other of his White Rose, not a co-author for your piece, but other authors with essays similar to yours in the latest White Rose magazine. So, Dmitri, thank you again for sharing your insights.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Please consider donating to the Institute for Liberal Values, a 501c3 nonprofit organization at ilvalues.org. All donations go to support our continued programming to realize our mission to provide the skills and support required to build community where there has been division, to encourage free expression where there has been censorship, and to foster optimism where there is fear.